The fastest way to discover who thinks they own something is to quietly stop replacing it. I noticed the propane issue the same way people notice most expensive problems. Not with a disaster. With a receipt that felt wrong. I had owned the tank for almost 4 years. 100-gallon stationary setup mounted behind the side fence near the patio. Nothing fancy. It powered my outdoor heater, backup cooking burner, and one small workshop line I rarely used. My usage pattern never changed much. Spring and summer barely moved the gauge. Fall and winter dropped more, depending on weekends outside. I knew the numbers because my father treated utility costs like weather. Not emotional, just measurable. He used to say if something starts costing more before your life changes, somebody changed your life for you. The refill truck pulled away on a Tuesday morning, and I remember looking at the invoice while standing in the driveway. I did the math automatically and paused. That refill came almost 6 weeks earlier than normal. Not impossible, just strange. I assumed I had used more than I remembered. Maybe colder evenings. Maybe extra workshop time. I shrugged and moved on. Then 3 weeks later, I walked past the tank and glanced at the gauge. My feet stopped before my brain did. The needle had dropped more than expected. Not dramatically, just enough to make me look twice. I opened the side gate and crouched beside the tank. 42%. That made no sense. I had not even used the patio heater that month. I checked the line connections. No smell. No frost. No obvious leak. Everything looked normal. I closed the gate and forgot about it for another few days. Saturday afternoon, I decided to test my own memory. I walked through the house mentally counting actual use. 1 dinner outside. 1 workshop evening. 1 cool night on the patio. That should not have moved the gauge that much. I opened old invoices stored in the garage. Same season last year. Same temperatures. Completely different consumption. Interesting. Still not enough to accuse reality of being wrong. Sunday morning, I cleaned the patio and noticed something I had never paid attention to before. Behind the community pavilion, 2 houses down, sat a portable event grill and heater setup. HOA equipment. I had seen it 100 times. Nothing unusual. Then I noticed a propane hose running farther than I remembered. I stared for a second and laughed at myself because obviously nobody was connecting community equipment to random houses. That would be ridiculous. I kept cleaning. Monday evening, I got home later than usual. Around 6:30. As I parked, I noticed people setting up folding tables near the pavilion for one of those community nights where everybody brings snacks and acts surprised that neighbors exist. I walked inside carrying groceries and happened to look out the kitchen window toward the side gate. The gate was closed, but not fully latched. Tiny difference. Enough to notice if you are the person who always closes it. I put groceries down and walked outside. The gate moved with almost no resistance. I opened it. Everything looked normal. Tank. Lines. Storage bins. Then I noticed something even smaller. A faint drag mark in the gravel beside the tank platform. Like something flexible had rested there recently. Probably nothing. I closed the gate again and walked toward the pavilion because curiosity is cheaper than assumptions. Diane Keller from the HOA board stood near tables organizing decorations. She smiled and asked if I was staying for the event. I said maybe later. Then she casually said they almost had to cancel because fuel arrangements had been difficult this month. Strange wording. Fuel arrangements. I asked what she meant. She laughed and said community logistics never end. Then she changed the subject. I stood there for a second longer than normal. Nothing suspicious. Nothing dramatic. Just one strange sentence landing next to one strange invoice and one strange gauge. That night after everyone packed up, I stepped outside before bed and looked across the quiet street. The pavilion lights were off. My side gate was closed. Everything looked ordinary. But for the first time since the refill, I stopped thinking about how much propane I used and started wondering who else thought the tank belonged to. Once you notice a number behaving strangely, your brain starts replaying ordinary moments like security footage. The next morning before work, I walked straight to the side gate with coffee instead of opening emails. The tank sat exactly where it always had. White paint fading slightly. Regulator covered. Gauge sitting lower than I wanted. Nothing dramatic. I crouched and looked closer. That was when I noticed something I should have seen earlier. The shutoff valve had fresh handling marks. Tiny scratches around the metal edge. Clean spots where dust had been disturbed. Not impossible. Delivery technicians touch valves. Maintenance happens. But I had not touched it since the refill. I stood there for a second and felt that strange feeling where your brain is not ready to accuse anyone, but also refuses to let something go. My father used to say there is a difference between suspicion and attention. Suspicion looks for villains. Attention just counts. So I counted. Tuesday morning, I took a photo of the gauge. Wednesday morning, another. Thursday morning, another. Same time every day. I did not change behavior. No patio heater. No workshop line. No outdoor cooking. If the number moved, something else moved it. By Friday, the needle had dropped again. Small amount. Too much for doing nothing. Interesting. That evening, the HOA hosted another setup at the pavilion. Movie night. Folding chairs. Portable heaters, even though the temperature did not justify them. I walked over carrying iced tea because curiosity with witnesses feels healthier than curiosity alone. Diane was arranging supplies and looked stressed. She smiled and said community events are becoming more expensive lately. I joked and asked if fuel prices got worse. She laughed immediately and said, "Do not even get me started." Then she added something strange. "At least we have flexible backup options nearby." Flexible backup options. I nodded like I understood and changed the subject. Later, I wandered around casually and noticed something that made me stop. Behind the pavilion storage cabinet sat a coiled propane extension hose. Long one. Longer than I expected. I looked at it for half a second and kept walking because jumping to conclusions is expensive. Saturday morning, I checked my side gate again. Closed. Not latched. Again. That bothered me more than the gauge. Gates do not forget themselves. I decided to test something harmless. I wrapped a thin strip of blue painter tape around the inside latch. Invisible unless you knew where to look. Not security. Just information. Sunday afternoon, neighborhood barbecue. People moving tables. Children running around. Normal. I stayed inside most of the day. Around 5 o'clock, I walked out pretending to take trash bins in. The side gate was closed. Tape broken. Clean separation. Nobody had bothered hiding it because nobody expected anybody to care. I stood there looking at the tiny piece of tape and suddenly understood something uncomfortable. Whoever opened the gate believed they had permission. Monday morning, I checked the gauge. Another drop. Not huge. Enough. That evening, I sat in the garage with old invoices spread across the workbench. Refill dates. Seasonal weather. Usage estimates. Then I noticed something that made me laugh out loud because it was so absurd. Every abnormal usage period lined up almost perfectly with community event weekends. Not exact. Close enough to make coincidence uncomfortable. I stared at the page for a while. Then I closed the folder because numbers do not become more true if you look angry while reading them. Tuesday evening, I walked outside and stood near the tank listening to distant setup noise near the pavilion. Sunset. Quiet neighborhood. I reached down and touched the regulator cap lightly. Cold metal. My property. My account. My refill invoices. Then I looked toward the community area and realized the strangest part was not the possibility that someone used my propane. The strangest part was that if it were true, nobody probably thought they were stealing anything. They probably thought they were borrowing convenience. And that thought bothered me more than the gas. People act very differently when they think something belongs to everyone instead of someone. That thought stayed with me all week. Not because of the propane. Because of the confidence. If somebody had opened my gate once by mistake, I would not still be thinking about it. But repeated behavior changes the feeling. Mistakes leave fingerprints. Assumptions leave routines. Wednesday morning, I changed nothing except one detail. I cleaned the top of the propane gauge with a cloth and placed a tiny pencil mark beside the needle position. Not visible unless you were standing inches away. Not security, just measurement. Then I left for work. That evening, the neighborhood pavilion was active again. Portable heaters, food warmers, folding tables, community committee meeting. I parked in the driveway and resisted the urge to check the tank immediately because if you rush to evidence, your emotions start editing reality. I carried groceries inside first, put everything away, waited 20 minutes. Then I walked to the side gate. Closed, not latched. Again, the pencil mark had moved. Slightly. Enough that I stared for several seconds before checking myself. Gauges fluctuate. Temperature changes. Pressure changes. Fine. I took a photo and closed the gate. Thursday, I did something different. I sat outside with coffee near sunset and pretended to read while facing the side yard. Around 5:50, the pavilion started setting up. People moving tables. Someone rolling equipment. Diane crossed the lawn carrying a clipboard. Then I saw something that would have meant absolutely nothing to anybody else. A volunteer wheeled over the same long propane hose I noticed earlier. Not connected, just present. I watched casually. 10 minutes later, Diane walked toward my side of the property, carrying decorations. She disappeared behind the hedge line near my fence, then reappeared empty-handed. Not suspicious, just odd. 30 minutes later, setup finished. Community heaters worked. Everything looked normal. Friday morning, I checked the tank. Gauge lower again. My father used to say the hardest truths are the ones where nobody hides because nobody thinks they need to. I stood there looking at the numbers and suddenly realized something. I had never actually asked a direct question. I had only collected strange details. That afternoon, I walked over to the pavilion while nobody was there. Public area. Open access. Nothing secret. I looked around casually and noticed something mounted beside the equipment cabinet. A handwritten checklist laminated in plastic. Chairs. Extension cords. Serving trays. Heater setup. Fuel line. I read the line twice. Verify hose access. Not propane delivery. Not fuel refill. Hose access. Interesting wording. Then I noticed another detail. Someone had drawn an arrow beside it. Side fence route. I stared for a second and laughed once because suddenly everything became absurd. My side fence was the shortest route to the pavilion. I looked toward my house. The gate. The tank. The distance. Nobody had built a secret operation. Nobody had hidden anything. Somebody had apparently solved a convenience problem once and then left the solution in place long enough for it to become normal. Saturday evening, there was another event. This time I stayed outside watering plants. Around 6 o'clock, Diane walked over smiling and asked if I was coming. I said maybe later, then casually asked if event logistics had improved. She laughed and said yes, thankfully we already have fuel access handled nearby. Nearby? Such a comfortable word. I smiled and nodded. Then I asked what nearby meant. She paused for maybe half a second and said, oh, just local arrangements. Then she immediately changed subjects. That half second told me more than the answer. I went back to watering. She walked away. That night after the event ended, I checked the side gate one more time. Closed. Not latched. I opened it slowly and looked at the tank sitting quietly under the porch light. White paint. Brass valve. Gauge lower than expected. Ordinary object. Strange story. I stood there for a while and realized I no longer cared whether they used propane. I cared whether anyone had ever stopped long enough to remember whose tank it was. The moment I stopped trying to prove something and started trying to understand it, the whole situation became simpler. If people were using my propane, then there had to be one thing they depended on more than the gas itself. Predictability. Systems survive on routines. Sunday afternoon, I sat in the garage with old invoices, photos of the gauge, and dates from neighborhood events spread across the workbench. It looked dramatic, but honestly, it was mostly spreadsheets and boredom. I lined everything up. Refill dates. Community events. Estimated outdoor temperatures. Tank percentages. The pattern was not perfect because real life never is. But it was close enough that I stopped asking whether something unusual was happening and started asking what would happen if the routine disappeared. Not confrontation, just interruption. Monday morning, I walked out to the tank carrying coffee and looked at the side gate. Same slightly loose latch. Same tank. Same quiet assumption sitting there in painted steel. I opened the regulator cover and checked something I had ignored for years. There was a lock tab built directly into the shutoff assembly. Not unusual. Just one of those features you never use because most people assume access belongs to whoever owns the tank. I stared at it for a second and laughed quietly because sometimes solutions look boring. My father used to say boundaries are strongest when they require zero speeches. I went online and ordered a weather-resistant utility lock. Nothing dramatic. Tuesday afternoon, it arrived in a box smaller than expected. I left it unopened on the garage shelf. Not because I was nervous, because I wanted one more piece of information first. Wednesday evening, there was another community setup. I came home early and sat on the patio pretending to organize tools. Around 5:45, I heard movement near the pavilion. Tables. Folding carts. Somebody laughing. Then I heard something else. Metal lightly touching metal. My side gate. I stayed where I was. 10 seconds later, another quiet sound. Gate closing. Not latching. I waited. 5 minutes. Then I walked over. The gate had moved. Tank looked untouched. Gauge unchanged. But something felt different. Not evidence. Familiarity. Like somebody opened the gate the way people open a refrigerator at their own house. That bothered me more than anything else so far. Thursday morning, I opened the small lock box and held the lock in my hand. Heavy enough to feel permanent. Ridiculous enough to feel unnecessary. I carried it outside and looked at the valve assembly. Then I stopped. Not yet. Because locking something changes the story. Before that moment, it was observation. After that moment, somebody notices. I wanted to be sure I was changing access and not creating a misunderstanding. Thursday evening, I walked over to the pavilion during setup and casually asked Diane if the HOA rented fuel for events or owned equipment. She smiled and said a mix of solutions depending on availability. Interesting answer because it explained nothing. I asked whether event costs had stabilized. She laughed and said thankfully we found ways to stay flexible. Flexible again. I smiled and said sounds efficient. She nodded proudly. Then somebody called her away. Friday afternoon, I came home early. Warm weather. Quiet street. No event scheduled. I opened the side gate and stood in front of the tank for a long minute. White paint. Brass valve. My refill invoices. My account number. My side fence. No anger. Just ownership. I attached the lock through the valve tab slowly. Click. One clean sound. Not dramatic. Not aggressive. No signs. No notes. No message. Just normal storage practice. Then I closed the gate completely and latched it. That evening, nothing happened. Saturday morning, nothing happened. Sunday afternoon, I almost forgot about it entirely until around 4:30 when I walked outside and noticed 3 people standing near the pavilion looking at equipment. Diane was holding papers and talking with unusual energy. Nobody looked upset, just confused. Then I noticed something strange. Twice in 10 minutes, she looked toward my side fence. Not at me, at the fence. I stood there watering plants and suddenly realized something. For the first time in weeks, I had changed absolutely nothing except one small lock. And somehow the neighborhood routine already felt different. The first sign that I had accidentally interrupted something larger than I expected was not anger. It was confusion. Monday evening, the pavilion looked unusually quiet. Not empty, just unfinished. Tables were out. Decorations half placed. People standing around with the specific expression people make when technology stops working, but nobody wants to admit they do not understand why. I was trimming a shrub near the driveway when Diane walked over carrying a clipboard and wearing the polite smile people use when they are trying to gather information without sounding like they are gathering information. She asked if I had noticed any issues with utilities lately. Utilities. Interesting word. I said nothing unusual. She nodded and then casually asked whether I had made any changes to outdoor equipment. Outdoor equipment. Even more interesting. I thought for a second and said I locked my propane tank because the gate had been opening lately and I wanted to keep everything secure. She paused for maybe 1 second too long. Then she smiled and said that makes sense. Security matters. Then she walked away. That conversation told me more than any evidence so far. Not because of what she said, because of what she did not ask. She did not ask what kind of lock. She did not ask why now. She did not ask whether anything happened. She already knew exactly which equipment I meant. Tuesday morning, I checked the tank. Gauge unchanged. First time in weeks. Same needle position as yesterday. That caught my attention immediately. Wednesday morning. Same. Thursday morning. Same. No usage. None. I stood there with coffee and laughed quietly because suddenly the entire mystery became less mysterious. Nothing leaked. Nothing failed. Access changed and consumption stopped. My father used to say systems confess faster than people. Thursday evening, another community event was scheduled. Around 5:30, I noticed unusual activity at the pavilion. More people than normal. Folding tables moved twice. Someone unloading portable heaters. Then I saw 2 volunteers rolling in a rented propane cylinder on a dolly. New tank. Fresh label. Interesting. Diane noticed me watching and walked over smiling. She said they finally sorted out fuel logistics. Finally. I nodded and asked if the new arrangement worked better. She smiled and said it costs more, but at least now they know exactly what they are using. That sentence landed quietly between us. At least now they know exactly what they are using. I smiled and said tracking costs usually helps. She nodded and looked away. Nobody said anything else. That night, I walked by the pavilion during setup and something immediately looked different. Equipment placement changed. Hose routing shorter. Storage area reorganized. Everything looked more intentional. Like somebody redesigned a system after discovering it was built on assumptions. I stood there for a second and noticed something else. The laminated checklist had changed. Heater setup, fuel verification, rental confirmation. No more mention of hose access. Gone. Friday afternoon, I was organizing tools when there was a knock at my door. Diane stood there holding a folder and looking mildly embarrassed, but mostly practical. She said she had a strange question. She asked whether the HOA had ever requested access to my propane tank. I said not once. She looked down and nodded slowly. Then she said she had been reviewing event notes and realized fuel sourcing had become informal over time. Informal. Interesting word because informal sounds cleaner than what she actually meant. She explained previous volunteers apparently created shortcuts for convenience, and eventually nobody questioned them. She looked genuinely uncomfortable and said she thought somebody had arranged permission years ago. I asked if anyone ever checked. She smiled awkwardly and said apparently not. Then she thanked me for securing my equipment because it exposed a process they should have fixed a long time ago. I told her I was mostly trying to keep my gate closed. She laughed and said sometimes small locks reveal large habits. After she left, I walked to the side yard and looked at the tank. Same white paint, same brass valve, same little lock hanging there doing almost nothing. That was the part one could not stop thinking about. The lock never stopped anyone from taking propane. It only asked one quiet question nobody had asked before. Who exactly thought this was theirs to use? The strange thing about removing a hidden convenience is that nobody misses the object. They miss the assumption. After the lock went on, the neighborhood did not become dramatic. Nobody complained publicly. Nobody accused anybody. Things just became unexpectedly complicated. Community nights still happened, but suddenly there were discussions about reservations, receipts, delivery windows, rental pickups, storage schedules, and fuel budgeting. Normal things. Things that probably should have existed already. I only noticed because all of it became visible at once. The next week, I was walking past the pavilion and saw 3 people standing around a whiteboard discussing event expenses with the seriousness of a space program. Diane looked up, saw me, and laughed. She said, "Congratulations, you accidentally introduced accounting." I smiled and said sorry to hear about the tragedy of organized logistics. She laughed harder than expected. Then she said something interesting. She said nobody realized how much of the setup depended on nearby availability until nearby stopped being automatic. Nearby? Still avoiding specifics. Still careful. That told me nobody was trying to hide anything anymore. They were trying to understand how they got there. Thursday afternoon, I checked the propane gauge again. Same position. Almost perfectly unchanged. I stared at it for a second and realized I had stopped thinking about cost. The number itself had become symbolic. Same tank. Same weather. Same owner. Different assumptions. Friday evening, Diane knocked on my door again. This time she carried a folder and looked less embarrassed and more amused. She said she wanted to show me something because apparently I had become unintentionally involved in community operations. Inside the folder was a revised event checklist draft. Equipment, rentals, fuel source, permission verification, resource ownership. The last one caught my eye. Resource ownership. She noticed and smiled awkwardly. Then she said they discovered nobody could identify when the fuel arrangement started. One volunteer remembered somebody saying access had already been approved years ago. Another thought the pavilion originally had independent supply. Another assumed the HOA purchased shared fuel. Nobody knew. The funniest part was nobody could identify a moment where someone decided to use my tank. It just slowly became normal. I looked at the page and suddenly understood why I never felt angry. Nobody had created a secret. They created momentum. Diane looked uncomfortable and said she hoped I did not think people intentionally took advantage. I told her honestly I did not think that anymore. I thought people stopped asking because the system kept working. She nodded immediately and said that sounded worse somehow. Saturday there was another event. New rented cylinders. Proper setup. Volunteers checking labels. Everything looked slightly slower but noticeably calmer. I stopped by for 10 minutes and somebody asked jokingly whether I approved the fuel source. I laughed and said I retired from energy oversight. Then one older resident walked over and said something that stayed with me. He said communities get weird when convenience hides ownership. That line followed me home. Sunday morning I opened the side gate and looked at the tank. Same lock. Same white paint. Quiet. I realized something I had not expected. I did not want to remove the lock anymore. Not because I thought someone would use the propane again. Because the lock had become a reminder. Not keep out. Just check first. Monday evening I came home and found a small laminated tag hanging from the pavilion storage cabinet. Community resources. Verify before use. No names. No explanations. Just one sentence. I stood there longer than necessary looking at it because I recognized the feeling immediately. It was the same feeling as seeing your side gate finally closed properly. Nothing dramatic changed. Everything simply became visible again. Later that night, I sat on the patio with the heater running for the first time in weeks and watched the flame move steadily. My propane. My schedule. My refill date. Ordinary things. My father used to say ownership does not mean using something first. It means being the person everyone remembers to ask. Looking at that quiet tank behind the fence, I realized nobody had actually panicked when the lock appeared. They just had to notice the boundary they stopped seeing. The question that changed everything was not who used the propane. It was who believed they had permission. Once that question appeared, people started noticing things that had been invisible for years. A few days after the checklist changed, I walked past the pavilion on my way back from the mailbox and noticed two volunteers standing beside the storage cabinet holding old binders. They looked confused in the specific way people look when history turns out to be less organized than memory. One of them laughed and said apparently nobody documented anything before 3 years ago. Diane noticed me passing and waved me over. She held up a stack of event planning notes and said they were trying to rebuild procedures because half the instructions were inherited verbally. I asked what that meant. She smiled and said apparently every committee copied the last committee and nobody questioned why things worked the way they did. That sentence explained more than any apology could. They had not inherited permission. They inherited assumptions. Diane showed me one old event sheet. Equipment setup. Table placement. Decoration bins. One handwritten note in faded ink. Confirm access route. No explanation. No source. Just those words. Access route. Everybody had interpreted that differently over time until eventually nobody remembered the original meaning. I looked at the note and laughed quietly because sometimes systems collapse under the weight of one missing noun. Thursday evening, the neighborhood held a small meeting before the usual gathering. Nothing formal. Folding chairs. Water bottles. People talking. Diane stood up and explained they had updated event logistics to clarify ownership and reduce dependency on informal arrangements. Nobody mentioned me. Nobody mentioned propane. But then one resident raised his hand and asked a simple question. Wait, were we using somebody else's equipment before? Silence for about 2 seconds. Diane smiled carefully and said unintentionally and without clear documentation. The room reacted exactly the way I expected. Nobody looked angry. Mostly embarrassed. One older couple immediately started telling stories about things they accidentally assumed belonged to everyone over the years. Somebody laughed and admitted they once borrowed a wheelbarrow for months because they forgot where it came from. Suddenly, the whole room shifted from blame to recognition. That surprised me. After the meeting ended, several people stayed around talking. One neighbor walked over and said he never realized the side yard near my fence belonged entirely to my property line because the setup looked so integrated into the event layout. Interesting. Visibility again. Once something becomes useful enough, people stop seeing its edges. Friday afternoon, I came home and noticed something different immediately. The side gate. Fully closed. Perfectly latched. Not dramatic. Just correct. I stood there longer than necessary. Nobody announced it. Nobody explained it. But suddenly the gate had become a gate again instead of a hallway. Saturday morning, I checked the propane gauge out of habit. Same position. I smiled and realized I had stopped taking photos days ago. I no longer needed evidence because the system had already answered the question. That afternoon, Diane stopped by carrying coffee and laughed before she even reached the porch. She said she found out where the whole thing probably started. Years ago, during a storm outage, someone temporarily connected community equipment to nearby fuel access to keep an event running. Temporary became convenient. Convenient became normal. Normal became invisible. Then nobody owned the decision anymore. I asked if she was upset. She shook her head and said honestly she was relieved because she kept expecting to find somebody doing something intentional and instead found ordinary people skipping one question too many times. Then she looked toward the side yard and smiled. She said your lock accidentally became our audit process. After she left, I walked to the tank again. White paint, small lock, quiet fence, same ordinary setup. But now when I looked toward the pavilion, I noticed something I had not seen before. Their rented cylinders had labels, inventory tags, storage dates, ownership marks. Nobody had lost access to anything. They just started naming what belonged to whom. And standing there in the late afternoon light, I realized the real reveal was not that people had used my propane. The reveal was that nobody noticed until ownership finally became visible again. Once people started naming ownership out loud, something unexpected happened. The neighborhood became easier to live in. Not because rules got stricter, because invisible systems became visible again. 2 weeks after the meeting, the pavilion looked completely different. Same tables, same storage cabinet, same folding chairs. But now there were labels everywhere. Event supplies, HOA property, rental equipment, return date, fuel inventory. Somebody even laminated instructions for heater setup. Not because anyone suddenly became obsessed with procedures. They just stopped assuming somebody else knew. Saturday afternoon, I walked past while carrying mulch bags and noticed Diane kneeling beside a new storage rack with a label maker in one hand. I asked if she had started a second career in organization. She laughed and said this is what happens when one small lock creates an identity crisis. Then she pointed proudly toward a compact propane cage installed beside the pavilion. HOA event fuel storage. Independent supply. It looked ordinary, clean, not expensive, the kind of thing that probably should have existed years ago. I looked at it for a second and asked how long it took to arrange. She rolled her eyes and said 3 days and less money than 1 season of rented emergency solutions. Then she paused and smiled awkwardly. Apparently convenience had been expensive the whole time. Nobody just measured it correctly. That sentence stayed with me. Sunday morning, I opened my side gate out of habit and checked the tank. Same reading. Weeks now with almost no unexplained movement. The lock hung there quietly. Not challenged. Not questioned. I stood there for a minute and realized something funny. I no longer cared if the lock stayed forever. At first it felt like a correction. Now it just felt normal. Monday evening there was another community event, and for the first time in months I actually stayed. People gathered. Portable heaters worked. Food came out. Nobody discussed fuel. Nobody glanced toward my fence. Everything functioned. That was the interesting part. The new system did not create inconvenience. It removed dependence. I sat with a paper plate and listened to conversations drifting around the tables. At one point somebody joked that the HOA had entered its accountability era. Everybody laughed. Diane walked past and said she was considering putting that on a sign. Later in the evening, one older resident sat beside me and asked quietly whether I was annoyed about everything that happened. I thought about it honestly and said not really. He looked surprised. I told him the frustrating part was never the propane. It was realizing nobody noticed where the line was anymore. He nodded immediately and said communities drift when nobody owns small decisions. Then he pointed toward the new storage setup and said at least now somebody does. Before leaving, Diane stopped me and handed me a small laminated card. Community resource guidelines. Mostly boring rules. Return borrowed items. Document access. Confirm ownership before use. But at the bottom someone had added a sentence in smaller text. Convenience does not equal permission. I laughed immediately. She smiled and said that line came from committee discussion and somehow survived approval. Tuesday afternoon, I was trimming hedges when I noticed something else. My side gate had not been left open once since the lock appeared. Not once. No broken tape. No loose latch. No drag marks in the gravel. Nothing dramatic. Just absence. My father used to say respect often looks invisible because it mostly appears as things that stop happening. That evening I sat on the patio with the heater running low and looked toward the pavilion. Small storage cage. Organized setup. Quiet neighborhood. My tank behind the fence. Their tank beside the cabinet. Separate. Clear. Nobody lost anything. Nobody got punished. The strange part was realizing the final solution was not security. It was clarity. All the lock did was force one uncomfortable question, and once people answered it honestly, the whole neighborhood somehow became easier to understand. The final thing I expected to change was me. Months passed. Cooler mornings. Fewer community events. The propane lock stayed exactly where I left it. Not because anyone asked me to remove it. Not because anyone challenged it. It simply became part of the landscape. Like fences. Like mailbox posts. Like all the small things people only notice when they disappear. One Saturday morning I was cleaning the garage when I found the original refill invoices folded inside an old tool manual. I sat on a stool and looked through the dates again. The weird consumption, the early refill, the photos of the gauge I had forgotten to delete. Looking back at them felt strange because I realized none of those numbers mattered anymore. Not because they were wrong, because the story had already finished. My father used to keep old notes even after problems ended. I never understood why. Sitting there with receipts in my hand, I finally understood. Sometimes proof is not for arguments. It is for remembering what changed. That afternoon, there was a seasonal neighborhood gathering at the pavilion. Nothing elaborate. Coffee, snacks, folding chairs. I walked over and immediately noticed something that made me smile. Beside the storage cabinet sat the HOA propane setup. Clean, organized, inventory tags, spare fittings, usage log clipped neatly to the side. Someone had even painted a small white line on the pavement showing where equipment belonged. Tiny detail, obvious purpose. Diane saw me looking and walked over holding coffee. She smiled and asked if I approved. I laughed and said I retired from energy oversight months ago. She looked at the storage cage and said something interesting. She said they actually spend less now than before. I looked at her and asked how that was possible with rentals and tracking. She shrugged and said once they started measuring usage, they stopped wasting fuel. Then she laughed and added apparently accountability is surprisingly efficient. We stood there quietly for a minute. Then she looked toward my side of the street and asked if I ever planned to unlock the tank permanently. I thought about it and said maybe someday. Then I looked at the lock and realized the answer surprised me. I said probably not because it is easier this way. She nodded immediately like she understood. Not because of security, because clarity. Later in the afternoon, a new family visiting the neighborhood asked where community supplies were stored. Somebody pointed toward the cabinet and explained the setup. Then the person added a sentence without thinking. Everything has labels now, so it is easy. That made me smile more than it should have. Easy. Not because people became careful. Easy because nobody had to guess anymore. As the event ended and people packed up chairs, I walked home along the side fence. I stopped at the gate automatically. Opened it. Checked the tank. Same reading. Same lock. Same quiet corner. Then I noticed something attached to the inside of the gate with removable tape. Small laminated tag. Probably left as a joke. It read, private equipment. Public respect. No signature. No explanation. I laughed and left it there. That evening I sat on the patio with the heater running low and watched the neighborhood settle into quiet. Pavilion lights off. Storage closed. Side gate latched. Ordinary sounds. Nothing dramatic. And that was the part one appreciated most. No speeches. No punishment. No revenge scene. Just one small lock and a neighborhood remembering that convenience is not ownership. My father used to say the best boundaries do not keep people out. They help people understand where to stop. Looking across the yard and listening to the soft sound of propane burning exactly where I expected it to, I realized the whole story ended the same way it started, with a tank sitting quietly behind a fence. The only difference was that now everyone knew whose it was.